Could that be possible? Good evening. Thank you so much. It's a real pleasure to be here, and I'd just like to be able to thank the Aging Interest Group, especially Sarah, and then also Dr. Sebesky, who facilitated this presentation. And it's wonderful to be back in Omaha. It's wonderful to be back here at Med Centre, and actually this is the room I think I defended my dissertation in. So it's good to be back in here. So
I think the lights are it's going to be kind of all or nothing. So the movie was way dark, I thought. So, unless you want it that way.
No, it's just it's pencil drawings, and so it can maybe do. Let me see. I want to be able to see my notes. That's maybe a bit dark. That's maybe, yeah, no worries. Okay. So for my talk, actually, can we turn it up a little bit?
There's no in between.
That's all right. That's all right. I'm sorry, there's pencil drawings, and so they're a little bit harder to see, but maybe they'll be fine. Maybe they'll be fine. Anyway, I just want to be talking about the agenda, describe the agenda. So I'm going to describe the interactions between art and medicine in the field, a general overview of between art and medicine in the field of dementia. I'm going to describe my personal background, how I've come to where I am right now. Talking about Project Saving Faces and also Portraits of Care that was carried out here at Med Centre. And then I'm going to be introducing my PhD project, the experience of portraiture in a clinical setting, which was also carried out here at Med Centre. And then predominantly the focus of the talk will be on arts and Alzheimer's, and specifically drawings of Pat by Norman Gilbert. And so I have no disclosures. And the acknowledgements, I'd like to just acknowledge a few people in relation to this talk specifically that I've been able to give over the last year or so. I'd like to thank Dr. Regina Robbins, who's actually here in the audience, I'm happy to say, who's Assistant Professor at the Department of Sociology and Anthropology at UNO. She carried out the interview that's used that I'll be quoting from in this talk. I'd also like to thank in Halifax Professor Kenneth Rockwood, who's a leading geriatrician and Professor of Geriatric Medicine at Veterans Memorial in Halifax, Catherine Hominick, who's a clinical social worker and colleague of Dr. Rockwood, Linda Bird, who's the Director of Programs and Services at the Alzheimer's Society of Nova Scotia, and Wendy Stewart is Associate Professor of the Department of Pediatrics. All those people, what they did was they actually, when I was discussing the appropriateness of giving such a talk, they were a huge solace and encouragement for me to make this talk. And then finally, I'd like to thank my father, Norman Gilbert, who's an artist in Scotland. So, what can the arts tell us about care and caregiving and dying and bereavement? And how can people who are dying and bereaved use the arts? And I think these are important questions to ask for two reasons. First, death and loss are significant themes in all the arts. And second, though this presentation is primarily about my own personal reflection on the drawings carried out by my father as he cared for my mother at the end of her life, rather than about the end-of-life professional care, I hope that the work presented can potentially demonstrate how the visual arts can help professionals reassess the care they provide for people experiencing illness, their carers, and those who are facing the end of their life, their loved ones, and those recently bereaved. Dying used to be accompanied by a prescribed set of customs, and so these images here are from the Ars Moriendi, and which it was Latin for the art of dying, and it was extraordinary. It was a text and a series of images that were extraordinarily popular in the Middle Ages, and so it was a 1415 medieval Latin text, and it was reprinted more than 100, it had over 100 editions that were printed across Europe. And so the guide provided families with prayers and questions for the dying in order to put them in the right frame of mind during their final hours. We see in these woodcuts, the two that we see here, the natural world that the patient, we see a person inhabiting two worlds. The natural world he's about to leave with friends and possessions, family and home, and the supernatural world that only he can see with angels and demons vying for his soul. And then this is a painting I'm always happy to include. It's been one of my favourite paintings since I was about 12, and it wasn't until I ended up working in this kind of art medicine field that I realised it was actually carried out, made for a hospital. And so it's a crucifixion scene by that, it's entitled The Eisenheim Altarpiece by the artist Matthias Grunwald. And it's an example of art and medicine were able to interact on a more social and emotional and spiritual level. And so this crucifixion scene was installed in a hospital and a monastery. The patients with afflictions like the plague and yellow fever were confronted with this painting as they entered, because the monks felt that the patients would be able to recognize their own pathology in the way that the figure of Christ was rendered, and by doing so, were thus engaging with this representation of the miracle of Christ that could help to strengthen their own faith and thus improve the benefits, the perceived benefits of treatment. And so in the field of dementia, dementia art can and has been used as a tool for analysis for physicians and to be able to gain greater insight into the experience of the patient. The arts in all their forms can serve as an aid for the understanding of dementia and as a discipline for the study of the mind for clinicians, researchers, patients and carers. And so these pictures here by the artist William Utermohlen, I think, open up a window to his personal journey with his dementia. I'm only showing about 3 of a series of about 15 self-portraits he carried out during the progression of his condition. And I think when we feel when we look at the pictures, we maybe experience the anger, fear, anxiety, resignation, maybe isolation, sense of fragmentation of the self as the disease progresses. But, however, the artist's voice is so often the case, I think, is poignant with paradox. And so we may perceive that someone living with Alzheimer's is having lost so much that they have nothing left to give, yet something as powerful as these images, I feel, proves that notion wrong. And leaving us to ask, does dementia undermine creativity or does it just change its energy? These images are part of a collection of artworks created by local artists in an artist in residence program that was set up by Dr. Kenneth Rockwood in Halifax at the Veterans Clinic in Halifax, Nova Scotia. And so they're hanging in the clinic in his memory clinic at Veterans. And so the resultant artworks are a record of what the artist observes and interpreted visually and what they witnessed while working with patients and families. And so the paintings have reportedly enhanced clinical ambience, sometimes palpably diminishing the anxiety of those visiting the clinic, and also allowed and enabled clinicians to gain greater insight into the patient experience. Another example of art and medicine complementing each other also happens where I've been working in Halifax. And so the Artful Afternoon workshops are jointly organised by the local Alzheimer Society of Nova Scotia and the local Municipal Art Gallery of Nova Scotia. And it provides art-based activities for people with dementia and their partners in care. So I've had the pleasure of, over the last couple of years, of being a volunteer in this programme to witness how art can create and develop shared experiences and a sense of community, and enhance confidence and be empowering. And I realise that similarly, there have been a number of initiatives here in Omaha using the arts in relation to Alzheimer's, including the Art to Remember programme that was sponsored by Blue Cross and Blue Shield that enabled guided interactive interactions with the collection at Jocelyn Museum in collaboration with the Alzheimer's Association chapter here in Nebraska. So, to situate myself, and so this is a picture of me by my dad, Norman Gilbert. It's entitled The Artist, Family and Mark. And so that's me with the yellow ochre face and the green hair being held by my mum. And so for the last 65 years, my dad has worked on paintings in his studio in Glasgow, Scotland. His imagery relies heavily on depictions of his family ensconced in different settings, usually in the domestic settings where we lived, or maybe when we were on holiday, and so on. And so over the years, his pictures more often than not included me and my mum. So having lived in a house with where there was always art and where there was a studio always happening, it may be no surprise that I also went to Glasgow School of Art, where my mum and dad had actually met, and where they had studied. And I worked as an artist for about 10 years as a professional artist and more often than not, having my mum and dad coming to sit for me in paintings like this. Partly these paintings took anything up to 9 months, so obviously, frankly, my mum and dad were the only people willing to do such things, and even then, they weren't happy. Anyway, so. However, my life and changing methods changed dramatically when I was commissioned by facial surgeon Professor Ian Hutchison of the Royal London Hospital to work on Royal London Hospital in East End of London to work on a series of portraits of his consenting patients and depict them before, after, and during their surgery. And so this is a picture of Henry. And this is actually, the surgery is also in its own way a portrait of Henry. It depicts one of, a moment of Henry's surgery. And so I worked with the patients, I worked with somebody like Henry, and the purpose of these pictures that the surgeon hoped for is that the pictures would be able to communicate that people with facial surgery or have had facial cancer or are facially, different in whatever we have facial difference, are able to carry on living fulfilled, active lives regardless of what they've been through, regardless of how they look. So hopefully, a picture like this of Henry demonstrates the kind of charisma and the strength and the power of Henry, which he had in abundance, as well as humour and the sort of joie de vivre. And the surgeries, of course, being hung next to the portraits, hopefully weren't gratuitous or seen as voyeuristic, but actually added to the narrative, the visual narrative. And so, the portrait of Henry hopefully informs the surgery pictures, and the operation pictures also then maybe inform the portraits. And so these are two of a collection of maybe about 100 pictures that were done, working with about 40 patients. As a result of Saving Faces, the work I did with Ian Hutchison in London, touring venues in North America, I was asked, and this is where I was asked by Dr. Virginia Ater, who at that point worked at the College of Public Health here at UNMC, and also Dr. Bill Lydiot, who I'm glad to say is here in the audience as well, to come to the University of Nebraska and to be artists in residence for a research study in which we called Portraits of Care. And so the portraits that you see here of Roger and of Sebrin are a part of a collection of exactly 100 portraits I made in collaboration and representing patients and caregivers attending and working here at UNMC. And so the patients I was working with was everything from childbirth to people who were experiencing the last days of their lives. The caregivers I worked with and depicted were familial caregivers, professional caregivers, surgeons, physicians, nurses, but then also everything from the chief executive of Douglas County Health Authority to the janitor that cleans the university corridor to cancer research specialists, chaplains, social workers. So we really were trying to kind of visually depict the abundance of community of care that happens here in Omaha and working here at UNMC. And so the project, Portraits of Care, sought to use art, specifically portraiture, to explore notions of illness, recovery, care and caregiving. And so the research findings in both these, this is me working actually, I can't remember which building it was, it's now renovated, it's just Epley building. So I was working in an old science lab that was still replete with beakers and test tubes in the science lab, which is obviously usually a very clinical, a very clean clinical space. And so I would be getting into trouble for footprints through the corridors and so on. And they were actually experimenting with botulism, I remember, across the... Anyway, so... But this is where I worked, this is where I spent time, this is where myself and the participants spent time with each other, shared our stories, and as the pictures were developing. So as I say, the research findings on both the studies focused on the effects of the final pictures, of the resultant pictures on the participants themselves, and then also on the audience that viewed them in the exhibitions. However, with my experience of having worked with all the participants and spent time with them, I became acutely aware of how fundamental the nature and relationships and of the interactions between myself and the subjects involved in the process was in the making of the portraits. And so that is what inspired the exploratory study for my doctoral study, which was entitled The Experience of Portraiture in a Clinical Setting, which was shortened to EPICS. So my doctoral project sought to explore the nature and shared experiences. Oh, there we go. So my doctoral study sought to explore the nature of shared experiences of artistic interactions with a professional artist-sitter relationship, between a professional artist-sitter relationship, and between, one artist and 5 patients, a small cohort of 5 patients who were attending at that point in the head and neck cancer clinic here at UNMC. And so the pictures and interviews and study transcripts were analysed. And we found that the emergent themes here that you can see, so the experience of portrait in clinical setting involved for both artists and sitters, that they engaged in embracing their uncertainties, developing trusting relationships, engaging in reflective practices, telling a story, and then as a result of that, those interactions feeling ultimately empowered as a result of that. And so we found that these emergent themes paralleled salient aspects of the doctor-patient relationship, but I would also propose that they are the basis and applicable to any compassionate relationship. And as such, were applicable between the relationship between my mum and dad. So this is my dad. This is my dad in his studio. As I say, he's a practicing artist. He's 90, he's that far off, 91, and still practicing in Scotland, and has actually a retrospective exhibition in Scotland in January. And so he had drawn and painted my mother hundreds of times over the last 65 years. And so each of my dad's paintings, including this one of my mum, embodies a phase in his life and her life. And the paintings build on my dad's prior experience of painting, his knowledge and familiarity with the materials that he uses, and his knowledge of and relationship with my mum and the settings in which she is depicted. So yeah, so this is an early picture from 1954, when we were first married. And so over time, his pictures developed into larger, more colourful compositions like these. And so the figures, the way he depicts the figures, they have a neutral expression. And although the figures in his paintings are easy to perceive, they are to a certain extent the central focus of attention. They are rendered with the same weight of line, colour and flat texture as the setting in which they are depicted. And so it's the patterns and the colours and the compositions that provide the emotional content to his pictures. However, the pictures still rely fundamentally on the relationships and interactions that he had with his loved ones and his environment. And so this painting here depicts myself when I was about 4 years old, with my mum. And so for each composition, he would execute numerous drawings like this one of my mum as preparatory sketches towards the larger compositions. So as I've already alluded to, about 6 years ago my mum was diagnosed with Alzheimer's. And in those last 6 years my dad continued to draw and paint her from multiple compositions. And although the Alzheimer's is never overtly referenced, I think once one is aware of the context of the creation, they become a powerful visual record, not just of an artist-sitter relationship and a husband and wife, but as a patient-caregiver relationship, one that required that they mutually supported and comforted each other and cared for each other. And so the paintings are a testament to the fluid roles we are all asked to play at some point in our lives when we fall in care for those we love. And so about 3 years ago, my dad was asked to allow this painting of my mum. It's technically a drawing, but anyway, this image of my mum, to be published in a journal to illustrate an article describing Alzheimer's, the experience of Alzheimer's. And so he'd never been asked for anything like this, for his pictures to be used for anything like this. And so although he had followed my career closely, and we had discussed medical humanities often, this concept was never something that he related to his own art. And at this point, he had to come to terms with the notion that art can be, in the same way as I had to, in the same way that I had to get used to this notion, that art can be an instrument in the field of medicine to teach, inform, describe, record, as well as evoke and inspire. And so I'd already realized the capacity and how art is able, can inform medicine in abundant ways with its capacity to communicate the seeable beyond the sayable. However, when I was told that my mum had had a massive stroke that left her unable to move or communicate, and from which she would not recover, I was still absolutely staggered to be told that as my dad kept vigil during what would be the last week of our life, that he had brought his sketchbook to the hospital to enable him to draw. And so a week after my mum died, a close family friend and my colleague at the University of Nebraska, Dr. Regina Robbins, carried out a semi-structured interview with my dad, asking him to reflect on those last days and the drawings he created of and with my mum. And so reflecting on the drawings in the interview, we found that the 5 emergent themes from my own research, from my doctoral research, were also relevant to my dad's experience of creating the visual narratives with my mum that I'll present for the remainder of this presentation. So the following images portray my mum as she lay dying in hospital for just over a week at the beginning of August last year. And so in the interview, my dad initially described how he hadn't any qualms about carrying out the drawings. He just hoped that he could do it justice. However, when describing the first drawings that he tentatively carried out of my mum's hands, he stated, and I quote, "Oh, I was absolutely terrified that I would not be able to do it. I was completely relieved when I found out that I could do it. I thought all I need to do is try to do it better. But I wondered, under these circumstances, would I be able to do it? And I was relieved to find that I could." And so reflecting on this first cautious drawing of my mum's hands, and especially the hand that couldn't move because of the stroke, he said, "It was in the same position, even when the nurses turned her around the other way. Her hand more or less remained the same. Somehow it's terribly evocative." And so he and my mum were fortunate that they had a room to themselves for the whole week. A large fraction, well, at least it's a large fraction of the people in the UK, maybe not here, but a large fraction of the people in the UK with advanced Alzheimer's disease, like my mum, die in hospital. In her case, the care went well, and as I say, they had a room to themselves. My dad had at least a reclining chair in which he was able to fitfully sleep. So the room played a large part in enabling the drawings to be done. And reflecting on the importance of the room, my dad stated, and I quote, "I was fortunate that not only had I the ability to do them, but I also had the place where I could do them. There was nobody else there. I mean, if she had been in a room with other people, I couldn't have done it. So that the whole thing was made possible partly by the hospital, by having a room to herself the whole week." So when describing the drawings for the first time, my dad tends to focus on, slightly interestingly, he tends to focus on the pictorial. He tended to focus on the pictorial structures, describing the images in purely visual terms. And so this was the language that he was comfortable with. It was something that he knew. He talked about the patterns on the sheets and her nightdress and the checks on the towel that my mum's head rested on. This may seem odd in the nature of the context to the situation, but to my mind, what he was trying to do when he was making the drawings was to make sense not just of what he was seeing, but also what he was feeling. At a time when nothing seemed to make sense, where the entanglement of emotions and feelings can be overwhelming. And so he's always striving to be able to, in all his pictures, to be able to seek some semblance of order, coherence, peace, serenity. And at this point, at a time of emotional upheaval and uncertainty. When asked for the reasons for doing the drawings, he had numerous answers. Initially he said, and I quote, "Because I thought it's what I do. I mean, some people might have read a book, It didn't enter my head to take a book, but it did enter my head to take a sketchbook. I could have put on the radio or a television. I didn't put that on for the whole time. And I don't think there was anything strange about doing the drawings. It was just something I spent my life doing." Another time he said, and I quote, "It actually took my mind off completely what I was doing. One of the doctors did come in and saw what I was doing, and I said, it's all right, it just keeps me sane. But really," and another time he said, "But really, when I was doing the drawings, I forgot. I was just drawing Pat again. And I had drawn her thousands of times before. I did to some extent forget. But ultimately, I think drawing allowed him a time to reflect and to find solace in the familiarity of drawing. And so it was for him normal. It seemed appropriate as he had drawn my mum so many times before." And so although we knew that my mum would not recover, we were told by doctors that she could survive in this state for weeks. At that time I was still in Canada, and I had just been home for a week. I'd just been home a week or two before for another opening of an exhibition of my dad's work in Edinburgh, Scotland. And so I had felt in my own mind, when I said goodbye to my mum after that visit, that it could potentially be for the last time. So I felt it would be better to return for the funeral to be able to maximise the time I could spend with my dad, helping him after she died. And so the fact I was not there led him to consider a further reason and a further role for the drawings. He stated, and I quote, "All the time I was doing them, Mark was the one I thought would appreciate them more than anybody else. It didn't dawn on me that really it was in his line of work. And it would somehow or other fit in with a whole lot of what he's been doing. And I said to him that really I was doing them because I thought this would be something I would be able to show him. He wasn't there himself, so I thought, well, the next best thing is draw it. And I think that Mark would have liked to have been there and couldn't. So I tried to do the next best thing." Now, what he was doing there, I think, probably for the first time in his life, was kind of addressing the fact that, about the narrative that are held in any pictures. I think artists are sometimes resist the notion of a kind of narrative because it doesn't seem visual. But of course, we do have visual narratives. So in this response that he's giving, he's explicitly addressing and embracing the notion that the pictures held a narrative and that they told a story. And not only that he was also explicitly recognising, even if it was tacitly, the power of the pictures to be able to engage with the experience. So he was addressing the fact that by showing somebody else the pictures, they too would be able to build their own picture of what was happening and what happened. And this was something I don't think he'd ever had to contemplate until these drawings. So when asked about how he felt about the drawings in relation to other pictures that he had done prior of my mum, he poignantly stated, "I think they are separate from the other works. I can't show them to her. Can't ask her what she thought of them. At one point, I did say there is no point in doing them because I can't show her them." And then later on he pondered further their potential merit. "I don't know if they have any significance. I don't know who would want them. I didn't do them thinking I would be able to make use of this in any particular way. I had no idea what I would do with them once I did them. It was partly to give myself something to do, and partly because I knew I could do it, and partly because doing them kept me sane. And I did forget the circumstances I was in while I was doing them, and that was a sort of relief." And so again, here what he's doing, I think for the first time, is that he's kind of recognising notions until I started working within the medical field and, and working with medicine and physicians and everything. What he was saying parallels what the participants and the physicians that I worked with, that the pictures, he was recognising that the pictures can be used as a means of engagement, as a focus for communication and for reflection. And he was also then demonstrating for the first time that they can be used as a coping mechanism. And these were all things that parallel my own research and my own experiences and the notions that I too had to come to terms with as I worked in collaboration with the patients and caregivers on my projects. And so this last quote is his account of making the final drawing of my mum. And I quote, "At the end, I was sitting in the chair beside her, and I was covered up with a hospital blanket, and I woke up about 2 in the morning and felt her arm. And it was colder than usual. And I looked at her chest and it was going up and down, so I knew she wasn't dead or anything. But then I looked at her mouth. Her mouth was really closed compared to what it usually was, but she was still breathing, but very slowly. And then I started counting between each breath, and she would breathe, and then I would count 1, 2, 3, up to 10, before she would take another breath, so that there were long gaps between each breath, and I sat doing that for about 15 or 20 minutes, just counting between each breath. And then there was a last breath. She just took a breath, and then there was a wee gurgle, and then there were no more breaths after that. And I thought, I've drawn her in every position up till now, so I will need to draw her in this way too. And I did. So the first thing I did after she died was draw her again. And then once I had done that, I opened the door, and one of the orderlies was sitting outside the door, and she said, I will go and get the nurse, and then I came home at about 3 o'clock in the morning. And so looking at the last drawing A week after doing it, he reflected, "It's not the best drawing I've ever done, but perhaps it's got a significance that the others haven't. I suppose for most people it would have a significance that the others haven't. Perhaps people would find it strange that I was able to do it under the circumstances, but it wasn't a difficult decision to make. I could have just gone and called the nurse, but I thought, no, I have another drawing to do." And I think when you look at the drawing, it seems different from the others. It's maybe more awkward, potentially a little less confident. And you can see in the other drawings that maybe they'd become more resolved, maybe a little bit more articulate. The final drawing, I've sometimes thought it's almost like he's looking at her for the first time again. And so while he's doing the drawing, I'd suggest that he's struggling to express and record what has happened, what he sees, and also what he felt. And I think you can sense that she is no longer alive. There is a noticeable difference, that there's been a shift. But to my mind, the drawing is not bad or poorer. It's a remarkable, raw, honest, vulnerable, loving drawing. And so I think he's trying to work out and make sense what he sees and what he feels. And this means, and he does this with the urgency of looking, and with the same urgency of looking, like every other drawing that he's ever done before, but only more so. And it wasn't long after the drawings I was reading a paper written by the British art critic and writer John Berger. And he wrote, reflecting on a drawing that he did of his father, and he said, "People talk about the freshness of vision, of the intensity of seeing for the first time, but the intensity of seeing for the last time is, I believe, greater." So, as I think that's my mum on the left, and then that's her. She's sitting on the wall, and that's her and my dad. So as already alluded to, my mum had also been an artist and an art teacher, having attended Glasgow School of Art, where she had met my dad. And so this is her sitting while at art school, and she actually had taught me art at high school. She was my high school art teacher for 4 years. So when she died, it was particularly touching, uplifting to hear from those who knew my mum as an art teacher, and to be told how she helped and inspired so many to articulate themselves through their art, and how she shared her belief that the arts in all their forms can help live one's life with passion, compassion, and care. And so when we are confronted with images like these and depicting illness, suffering, and care, we are invited to consider what we embrace and also what we resist and find difficult to cope with. But by engaging with such experiences, we can use them as fuel to transform them into something that is positive and constructive, maybe even beautiful or sublime. And so since the drawing's execution, the drawings have already been used, and this is a poster for the event, used by Dr. Kenneth Rockwood in Halifax to facilitate professional and public awareness and discussions of how we care for people with Alzheimer's disease and dementia at the end of their life, and the balance between treatment and care. And so it may be possible that these pictures can contribute to a public professional understanding of dementia and Alzheimer's. And so these pictures are a vivid description of what can happen. If they are thoughtfully presented, they may be able to inform public and care provider education and allow us to consider the relationship between those who give and receive care. And so I think they make us all, and I can certainly vouch for this, that they make us all more resilient by opening us up to new perspectives that tell stories, encourage us to reflect on our own experiences of loss, bereavement, and our own mortality. But more than anything else, these pictures are an intimate visual record of my dad's last week with his wife of 65 years. Thanks very much. Any questions?
Mark, thanks a lot. That was tremendous. And one of the things you've worked on for the past several years is the actual process of drawing and painting, and that relationship that exists between the artist and the sitter. How much of the product, that is the portraits themselves, require additional narrative, and is there a role for a story to go along with them as part of the educational process?
I think, the pictures, as an artist, the paint, you always think, and certainly I thought that, is that the paintings should be able to breathe and live and breathe on their own. You don't need the artist. The artists aren't the most, tend to not be the most talkative of people. They don't necessarily like talking about their work. They was sort of, I'd be saying, well, as an art school, the picture does my talking and so on, and things like this. So as an artist, that's the way we tend to think, and we certainly don't like to reflect on the process that we use either, because the process is, it's giving away your secrets, really. And so for artists to do, it's not something that comes easily to artists. It certainly isn't something that comes easily to my dad. I think he did it without even thinking about it, because he was forced into that situation. So I think there's a huge, I think there's scope for both. I think the pictures, one of the things is to be able to, I think there's huge benefits about, not giving a narrative, allowing people to come at the pictures fresh with their own interpretations, allowing the students, and I think this applies to, where it can become relevant for medical education, allowing students to be able to value their own judgments, but also then to appreciate and be open-minded about the judgments of others. So obviously when I'm giving you the story as well, and to a certain extent that's guiding your thoughts and feelings about the pictures. You're not necessarily making up your own story, you're very much listening to the story I have to say. So I think there's scope for both. So I absolutely think that there's scope for no narrative to accompany, and at the same time, we did the interview. When you pull the verbal data and the visual data, the drawings and my dad's words together, then obviously it makes something incredibly rich, and people can still make up their own minds and reflections. And as I say, the power of the story, I think, allows people to be able to, if not necessarily to, make up their own, maybe stifles that notion of making up your own interpretations, but I think it might empower, or it might augment the reflective process, just by hearing such as the words, the poignant words along with the strength of the images, I think it makes it an even more powerful vehicle for reflection, and, and makes it more challenging, makes it, but by making it more challenging, I think it becomes more positive. I noticed is that, I said that it's poignant with paradox. Nothing's that simple. My dad was doing it he says he forgot, and at the same time, by doing the drawings, he was immensely engaged with what he was doing. And so by being so engaged, he was also at the same time able to gain distance. And so I think the same goes with with your question. So I think it's different results. I think if you have as much, you don't want to put away strong data, So, but I think there could be potential to show the drawings without the interview, and just and that would have its own value. Yeah.
Obviously, from my perspective. Sorry. Hold it down. I gotta hold it. From my perspective, it's a very brave thing that your father did. Of course, I'm not an artist, so that's hard. Of course, I'm not an artist, but you probably, as a person who, you talk about the artist-sitter relationship, and you probably get some insight into how the particular people who are involved in and when you're drawing pictures of them and they have medical issues or physical issues, you probably get a feel for how they feel about that, or maybe they share that with you at some point while they're sitting as your subject. Could you comment on that? And also, I know it's impossible to ask the question of your mother, but what do you think she would have thought about your father drawing those pictures?
Okay, the first one is, so I've been incredibly privileged. The projects I spoke about were done over a great deal amount of time. So the Saving Faces was done over 2.5, 3 years. Portraits of Care was carried out over 2 years. My doctoral study was carried out over 3 months, but working with a much smaller cohort of models of sitters. And so absolutely you get to know them exceedingly well. I think the process of having your portrait made is, takes a certain amount of courage at the best of times, and it's almost instantaneously intimate. So if you're then working with something over and over again over a period of days, weeks, sometimes months, sometimes in some occasions over years, then you get to know them incredibly well. I've worked with so many people, it's very hard to be able to kind of generalize as to their response, but you find out, they tell you, I spend more time with them than they do with their physicians. I can say in many cases they tell me more things than they maybe say to their families. So you spend time, and I do think for all the findings, I've been lucky enough to be able to talk about different things, this kind of topic over the last couple of days. I think for all the findings from my own research, I think fundamentally and I was discussing this morning, fundamentally I think you can hone it right down to listening. And so what happens is that even though I'm the researcher, you aspire for it to be as collaborative as possible. And even though I'm the one with the brush in my hand behind the easel, I still aspire to be, I don't think that necessarily makes it not collaborative. Because what makes it collaborative is that there are other ways in which we are both holding our hands through this journey. Both myself and the participants enter into this incredibly intimate, sensitive relationship, not knowing the end at the beginning. So we're going in there with no hypothesis, no notions of what's going to happen. They've maybe never been drawn before. I've never met them before, and we go on this journey together. And fundamentally, what that process is one of exchanging stories and listening to each other. The retired physician and writer Rachel Naomi Remen talks about listening generously. And I think fundamentally that's what's happening. And frankly, when John Berger, who I quoted about the intensity of looking at something for the last time and the first time and so on, and the urgency that comes with that, also spoke about, reminded me that drawing is a form of listening. So the drawing is also a listening process. It requires, taking, being open to other perspectives, sustaining curiosity, and trusting the process, and that goes for me and the participants. So in relation to what my mum say about it, I know that my dad, when Gina asked him, she said, "What do you think?" And he said he thinks that she would say, "There he goes again." Yeah. So now, but it is tricky. I've kind of thought, I'm kind of surprised how little. We've worked on a paper together that kind of talks about reflective processes that we've just submitted. And so it was interesting that, Gina's working here and I'm working up in Canada. Gina, because it was a case study and it was only had one participant, being my dad, not my mum, there was no IRB required. I needed to get what they call an REB, which is the same thing up in Canada. And so that then meant that, and that wasn't, you might end up thinking, like, really? And at the same time, though, it allowed me to get to know the research and to be able to ponder these things. But I'm surprised, and it wasn't that they were kind of doubtful about it. It was just part of the protocol and so on. But I do wonder what she would think. She had her vanities like anybody else. When I painted her, she loved what she called the quality time we had together, but she hated the paintings. So yeah, then there was elements as well. My dad wasn't just. There's other things that I've not mentioned. There were edit. He did edit. So he was still concerned. I mean, he was obviously concerned for her as his wife and as the person, but even in the aesthetics. So, for instance, she actually had a breathing tube that was up her nose and it was kind of pinned in an awkward way. And he says, "I missed that out." He said, "I don't think she would have liked that." So. But it's an interesting question. But he had, any time I think I've kind of brought it up and kind of queried it more than anybody else. And when I speak to people just say he drew and painted her for 65 years. So I think she would say, "Oh my God, you're doing it again."
he also did say that he thought she would think it was strange if he didn't draw.
Yeah.
Are there any questions from the Carney campus? Since you're not necessarily visible, I want to make sure that we acknowledge that. So any questions from Carney?
There aren't any questions here, but I did want to thank you for coming and speaking. My grandmother died of Alzheimer's, so it kind of brings back a lot of emotions. But I really, really appreciate you coming here and speaking. So thank you.
Thank you.
Then I'll ask a question. Yes, thank you very much for sharing something that's very intimate and personal, obviously for your dad, but also for you. What do you think? What's the most important thing that healthcare professionals can take away from your work? What take-home message do we want to here with?
I mean, I should be able to answer this very quickly because we've been talking about virtually nothing else for the last 3-4 days. And I'll probably kick myself for giving the answer that I give because there's probably a better one out there. I mean, maybe somebody else, because somebody else can maybe remind me of something that I've said or even something that they think. Because it's always good when somebody else thinks for you, really. And I'm absolutely passionate about how the humanities and all their forms are able to work with medicine. I do think that that humanities can serve medicine incredibly well, but I'm also absolutely adamant about the notion of a collaboration. That the nature of a collaboration means that both parties ought to enter into a relationship and be and being transformed and changed. So the notion that the humanities are just going in there to add a kind of humanistic element with a kind of cynical view of medicine that medicine has, with all its specialities and with all its specialism and so on, is losing sight of the humanistic element. I get it, I hear it, I think there's examples, but I try and avoid that, because I know that my interactions with medicine made me more compassionate. And the arts do not have a monopoly on touchy-feely compassion, and neither does medicine and the sciences and so on have, a monopoly on rigor, empiricism, objectivity. I think that art is incredibly, can be incredibly relying, hugely on objectivity. It can be I think the drawings that I do, I aspire for them, and I think the drawings that my dad, I can speak about his things maybe without sounding conceited. I think the drawings that my dad did are deeply empirical. And rigorous and so on. And at the same time though, I think we have to realize and recognize, as artists, that the artistry of medicine, and the fact that how we can inform one another. Medicine has made me change what I think, absolutely transformed what I think art can do. I never believed that I could be working in the sort of field I'm doing, that I've worked in, that I could be working with, had the privilege of working with people, to have had the responses to the work, to have had the discussions, the interactions, the realizations. These were never things that that entered my head when I left art school. So it's absolutely changed me. And I know, gratifyingly, that I think the paintings have changed some of the people I've worked with. And I think at a time when, medicine's becoming much more, collaborative and interdisciplinary, then I think, again, at the art, the engaging with pictures like my dad's, or an engagement with humanities, can be a terrific way to be able to provide a safe space to either engage with those elements of our lives that we find most upsetting or challenging. And at the same time, I was just talking about this the other day with Dr. Lydia, I think at the arts, this kind of notion of this collaborative interdisciplinary focus that there is now, I think at the arts are, the arts are a terrific way of being able to kind of visualize and to be able to experience collaborations, again, in a relatively safe way and in a way that can, I think can be productive, because I think when you bring the arts and medicine together, it really does require a collaboration. you know, a deeply collaborative relationship. And so that's, I mean, I think there's probably multiple other things, and if anybody else wants to chip in, then by all means. But I think the time is ripe for, you know, for these type of, you know, for this type of interaction and for the arts and the humanities to be integrated even more. And frankly, I think that the art schools and everything, you know, I do think that, you know, bringing in other industries, bringing in other practices into the art schools and so on, I think would be hugely beneficial as well. You know, so it's not a one-way street. I really do think we have to aspire for that kind of mutuality, and then we all grow. You know, we all are changed. It's all that makes it much more positive, exciting, constructive, educational. You name it. Yes.
I have another question. So your view of this person that's sitting for you as an artist, do you think that matches as their view of themselves? And like, does that collaboration kind of lead you to the same end point of your painting?
Right, good question. The answer is not always. So I was actually speaking to one of the participants on my well, I mean, there's other examples like this, but I was speaking to one of the participants on my dissertation project last night, and then he said, you know, when you did that painting, I thought, I do not look like that. That is not me. But he was still happy to come all the time. I'm just, you know, it wasn't he was happy to come, and he, you know, and I could talk about him further about what he got. But that was, he said it at the time, and he reminded it. He said, but when I looked in the mirror, I realized it was me. He said, but I avoided looking in the mirror. So it was kind of, I guess, without trying to put words into his mouth, he was, you know, he felt, he tried to resist the notion that it was him, but then felt that it actually was more, you know, but whereas one of the other participants who unfortunately passed away said, you know, talked about, and it might be, he said it's almost more real than me, you know, and so the reactions are complex, deeply complex, you know, it's full of paradoxes, and they're all quite different. And obviously there's patterns as well that kind of you can start to pinpoint and to be able to kind of extract and to be able to look at and analyse. But at the same time, everybody experiences, the same way as everybody experiences their disease and illness in a different way, they experience the sitting for the portraits in a different way. But there are parallels with many of them. I'm trying to think, that's interesting about you say at the end of the day we end up in the same place. I don't think so. I mean, I think the people that I work with, I think they never lose sight that it's my interpretation, and at the same time, they still will say it's almost more real than me. You know, it's almost more real than me. It's a testament to what I've been through. It's a testament to my life. It's a testament to this relationship that we've had. You know, they're empowered by it being exhibited because they feel as if it represents them. And so again, yet at the same time, you know, they're absolutely cognizant of the fact that it's an interpretation. But it's an interpretation that they also then tacitly, maybe they know that they tacitly and actually fairly explicitly at times influence, just by being there. And, so it's very, it's rich and complex. Steve.
Mark, the first sentence of the mission statement of the Columbia University Narrative Medicine program is the care of the sick unfolds in stories. And I am sitting here totally immersed in your personal story, Norman and Pat and you. And to me, it's a literary text. I come out of that work. And as a reader, naturally, I'm thinking about myself in the Mark position. My parents are a little younger than yours. My dad, all due respect, doesn't have any reflective work at his disposal other than yelling at the football game, which probably works at some level. So if our concern is our caregivers and our providers are caregivers, and you've served the role as a caregiver, and let's say my dad, Tom's, in that position one day, how do we help him? How do we help the resistant ones? How do we help the detractors? Not just Dad, but maybe I'm talking about the resistant providers, the resistant medical students. I'm curious about your experience turning someone who's, no thank you, not the humanities, I don't want to have any part of it, I don't want to sit for your pain thing, I'm not interested, into, okay, I'll try it.
That's a big question. I mean, I think, you know, kind of in that sort of, you know, I think if it was just a one-sentence answer, you make it available. You just make them available. You know, you make the humanities available. You know, if you know, I'm trying to think of an example. It might be better that in waiting rooms and in hospital wards, if you don't want a television there, you don't need to have a television. You know, if you don't want the radio there, you don't need to have the radio. You might want to leave, you know, journals, empty, you know, pieces of paper, you know, just paper and pen, you know, write, play noughts and crosses, draw. I don't know, do potato prints. I don't, you know, make pasta pictures. You know, but seriously, I mean, just make it available. Make, you know, I'm trying to think, you know, if somebody wanted to, if somebody's going to be there, if it's in palliative care and they're going to be there for some time, then maybe just have, I don't know, half a dozen clip frames. You know, and there's hooks on the wall. You know, put what you like in it. You know, fill it with your own pictures. You know, music. You know, have books. You know, and so I think you just make it available. You don't force it. You don't, you know, yeah. You try and you very, very gently just make it available. Give people the choices. You know, and make sure the environment, maybe there's stuff there that might trigger, you know, so if you've got pencil and paper inside the room, then it might be handy if there's actually, if the hospital's actually kind of hanging some pictures and some artwork in somewhere elsewhere or nearby and things, you know, that maybe kind of just kind of gives a nod and a wink to this might be an option, this might be interesting, you know, bring artists in maybe. I mean, once you start thinking about it, I think it becomes huge, and I think you know, by me bringing in an artist in residence, and you know, you know, this, you know, by bringing in an artist in residence, you know, the physicians that I was working with, you know, Ian Hutchison in London,